He once thought she was the strongest woman he had ever known. Her words carried fire, her presence carried dignity, and her decisions carried weight. In a world where he felt constantly underestimated, she had been the one who believed in him, lifted him, and stood beside him. That belief had become the foundation of his respect, and respect was the lifeline of his love. Every glance at her used to fill him with quiet pride. Every conversation with her made him certain he had chosen the right person to share his life with. He admired not just her beauty but the strength of her character, or at least what he thought was strength. It had all started with little things, whispers of change that he ignored at first. She became careless with her words, dismissive of his efforts, and more concerned with appearances than with sincerity. Still, he convinced himself that these were only phases, that the woman he respected was still there behind the shadows of her moods. But then came the day that shattered everything, the betrayal he could neither forgive nor forget. It wasn't just about what she did, it was about how it stripped away the very respect that once glued his love together. He remembered that moment vividly. It was late evening, the sky outside painted in streaks of fading orange, when he discovered the truth. A truth he hadn't gone searching for, but one that landed in his lap with such brutality that it left no room for denial. The lies she told, the manipulation she attempted, the way she used his trust as though it was a tool to serve her own desires, it all came crashing down like a house of cards. The respect he once held for her collapsed instantly, leaving behind a hollow echo. He didn't scream, didn't rage, didn't even confront her the way she might have expected. Instead, he looked at her with a silence that froze her to the core. She saw it in his eyes. The pedestal she had been placed on was gone. She was no longer the woman who inspired him, no longer the partner he admired. In that silence she realized that respect, once broken, could not be repaired with excuses. She tried to laugh it off at first, to twist the story into something less harmful, something he might forgive. But his gaze didn't waver, and in that gaze she found her fall from grace. The house that had once echoed with warmth turned into a cage of silence. He still carried on with the daily routines, but without the warmth of acknowledgement. He would sit across from her at the dinner table, his hands steady, his voice calm, but there was no softness left for her. Every polite word was hollow, every glance empty. She began to realize that losing love was painful, but losing respect was unbearable. At night, she would sit on the edge of the bed, her eyes burning with tears she tried to hide. She whispered apologies he never asked for, explanations he never wanted. He lay beside her, not responding, not reacting, just existing in a world where she no longer held the power she once had. She tried reaching for his hand, trembling, but he withdrew gently, not with anger, but with indifference. That indifference was sharper than rage, colder than distance, and heavier than silence. Her cries grew louder as days passed. She decorated the house, cooked his favorite meals, tried to look like the woman he once loved. But each gesture only reminded him of the betrayal that had poisoned her image in his eyes. She begged for his attention, but what she truly wanted was his respect back, and that was the one thing he couldn't give. One evening, she found him sitting in the courtyard, staring into the distance as though searching for something far beyond her reach. She walked toward him, tears staining her cheeks, her voice shaking as she asked, "Can't we start over?" He didn't answer immediately. He turned his head slowly, met her desperate eyes, and said softly, "Respect is not something you beg for. It is something you live for. And you let it die." His words cut deeper than any shout could have. She broke down, sobbing uncontrollably, clutching at him as if her tears could rebuild what her choices had destroyed. But he remained still, his face calm, his heart armored against her cries. In that moment she realized her greatest loss was not his affection, not even his love, it was his respect. And without respect, every effort she made was nothing more than a shadow. She had fallen from grace, and no matter how much she cried, she knew she would never rise again in his eyes. They still lived under the same roof, but it felt like two strangers were sharing a house built for love. The walls carried their silence like heavy secrets, and every room whispered of what once was. She walked past him in the morning, her steps light, her eyes searching for his, but he never looked up. He sat at the table with his tea, quiet, composed, as though nothing in the world disturbed him. Yet it was the silence between them that disturbed her the most. She remembered the days when mornings were full of laughter. He used to tease her about the way she rushed around, always forgetting where she kept her scarf or her keys. He would wait at the door, smiling as she scrambled to get ready, and then they'd leave together, side by side, hand in hand. Now, he left before she even finished tying her scarf. No smile. No words. Just the sound of the door closing behind him, leaving her standing in the emptiness of a kitchen that used to feel alive. At night, the distance between them was worse. They still shared a bed, but the space felt endless. He would turn to his side, facing away from her, his breathing steady, his body still. She would lie there in the dark, her heart pounding with the weight of unspoken words. Sometimes she reached out, her hand hovering above his back, desperate to touch him, to remind him of what they once had. But fear always pulled her hand back. Fear of rejection. Fear of realizing that his warmth was no longer hers to claim. Days turned into weeks and the silence thickened. She tried everything she knew to break it. One evening she prepared his favorite dish, filling the house with the aroma of spiced lamb and fresh bread. She set the table carefully, candles flickering, plates shining. When he came home, he paused at the sight, his eyes briefly softening with memory. She rushed to greet him, her voice trembling with hope. "I made this for you, for us." He sat down, thanked her politely, and ate quietly. Not a single complaint, not a single smile. Just the mechanical rhythm of a man fulfilling a routine. Her heart cracked with every bite he took because she realized he was eating not out of love, but out of courtesy. The distance between them was no longer just emotional. It had seeped into every action, every gesture, every glance. She began to notice how he no longer shared anything with her. His victories at work, his frustrations, his thoughts, once they had been hers to share. Now he carried them silently, locking them away from her reach. When friends came to visit, he smiled and laughed, his voice full of life. But the moment the door closed and they were alone again, the silence returned, heavier than before. It hurt her to know he could still be himself with others but not with her. It was as if she had become invisible, a shadow in his life. She wanted to scream, to shake him, to demand he look at her the way he once did. But deep down she knew the truth. You cannot force respect back into a man's heart once it has died. The distance began to define their days. She would sit by the window watching him in the courtyard, his posture calm, his face unreadable. Sometimes he would stay outside for hours, lost in thought, and she wondered if he was imagining a life without her. The idea sent chills through her because she could survive his anger, but she couldn't survive his indifference. One night, unable to bear it any longer, she spoke. "Do you hate me this much?" she asked softly, her voice trembling. He didn't answer right away. He turned his head, looking at her with eyes that were no longer warm. "No," he said finally. "I don't hate you. Hate takes energy. What I feel is nothing, and nothing is worse." His words pierced her like a knife. Nothing. That was what she had become to him. She cried that night until her pillow was soaked, her body shaking with sobs. She wanted to apologize again, to promise she would change, to swear she would never betray him again. But she knew words meant nothing now. Her tears were just noise in a house filled with silence. Living under one roof had become a punishment. She was reminded daily of how close he was, yet how far his heart had gone. Every step he took, every breath he drew, every quiet evening they shared under the same roof reminded her of the truth she could not escape. Respect once lost builds walls that love alone cannot break. And so, night after night, she cried for his attention, but he never turned. The distance between them was not measured in steps or walls, it was measured in the absence of his respect, and that distance was infinite. His silence was not empty. It carried weight, and that weight pressed on her chest every time she tried to speak. There was no shouting, no slamming of doors, no cruel accusations. Instead, there was something worse, quietness so sharp it drowned every excuse she made. He had always been a man of few words, but now the absence of his voice felt like punishment, a wall she could not climb. She had thought, foolishly, that if he shouted at her, if he confronted her with rage, it would be easier. Anger, after all, still meant he cared. Anger left space for explanations, for defense, for hope. But this silence, this steady refusal to engage, was louder than any storm. It told her more clearly than words ever could. He no longer respected her enough to fight. One evening, as rain lashed against the windows, she stood before him, her hands trembling, her eyes red from crying. "Please," she whispered, "just say something. Tell me what you're thinking. Tell me what you feel." He looked at her calmly, his gaze piercing through her like glass. Then he turned his face away without a single word. That single gesture cut deeper than 1,000 insults. It was as if she didn't even deserve the sound of his voice anymore. Her excuses piled up inside her, desperate to spill out. She wanted to say she hadn't meant it, that she had been weak, that mistakes didn't define a whole person. She wanted to remind him of all the good times, the loyalty she had shown, the love they had once shared. But every time she opened her mouth, His silence swallowed her words before they could reach him. At dinner she tried again. She spoke lightly, pretending nothing was wrong, hoping he would ease into conversation. "Do you remember the trip to the mountains?" she asked softly, forcing a smile. "How you laughed when I slipped in the snow." He didn't even look up from his plate. He finished his meal quietly, placed the spoon down neatly, and stood. She followed him with her eyes, searching for a flicker of warmth. But his back was all she saw as he left the room. She felt small, invisible, like a voice shouting into an endless void. The silence began to torment her mind. Every time he walked into a room, she panicked, trying to predict what he might be thinking. Did he despise her? Was he planning to leave? Or worse, had he already erased her from his heart completely? The quietness gave her no answers, only questions that burned holes in her sanity. Some nights, she broke down in front of him, sobbing uncontrollably, her words tumbling over each other. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to hurt you. I was wrong, I was blind, I was foolish. Please don't punish me like this. Please just say you still care." But he would only sit there, staring at the floor, his hands folded, unmoved by her desperation. His silence was deliberate. It was not the absence of words. It was a weapon sharper than any blade, stronger than any chain. It bound her in a prison of her own guilt. One night, when she thought he was asleep, she whispered into the darkness. "Do you know how much I love you? Do you know how much I regret everything?" She thought she was alone in her confession, but then she noticed the slow, steady rhythm of his breathing, too controlled, too deliberate. He was awake. He had heard every word. Yet he did not respond. That silence crushed her more than if he had shouted at her. Days blurred together. She stopped trying to make excuses out loud because she knew he would not answer. But inside her head, the justification screamed. "I only did it because I was lonely. I only lied because I was scared. I never wanted to hurt you." Over and over, she repeated them, clinging to the thin hope that if she believed her excuses, maybe he would too. But his silence told her the truth. Excuses don't heal betrayal, they only deepen the wound. The household began to reflect their unspoken war. The sound of clinking dishes, the creak of a chair, the shuffle of footsteps, these became the only conversations they shared. Even neighbors noticed the change. Once they had been the couple people admired, always together, always smiling, always in sync. Now, when guests came, he spoke politely, but his voice carried no warmth toward her. She, in turn, overcompensated, smiling too much, speaking too brightly, trying to mask the cracks that had already swallowed her whole. One evening, in the courtyard under a silver moon, she broke the silence with trembling honesty. "You're killing me with this quiet," she said, her voice raw. "Please, scream at me, hate me, punish me, but don't ignore me like I don't exist." For the first time in weeks, he looked at her directly. His eyes were cold, unflinching. "You want me to scream?" he said softly, almost in a whisper. "But why would I waste my voice on someone who already knew the truth and chose to ignore it?" Then he turned and walked away, leaving her standing in the night, her knees weak, her tears blinding. His silence had spoken louder than anger ever could. And in that silence, she finally understood. He had nothing left to say because in his heart, her excuses no longer mattered. She had never imagined herself as the kind of woman who would beg. Once, her pride was her armor, and her voice carried confidence that no one could ignore. But pride dissolves quickly in the face of indifference, and her voice, once so strong, now trembled with desperation. Day after day, night after night, she tried apologies. They spilled out of her like a broken faucet, flooding every corner of the house with words he never wanted to hear. "I'm sorry," she whispered at breakfast, her eyes searching his face as he stirred his tea. He didn't look up. "I'm sorry," she repeated when he walked past her in the hallway, his steps steady, his gaze fixed on some faraway point. At night, when he lay with his back to her, she reached out with trembling hands, pressing her forehead against his shoulder, whispering again, "I'm sorry, I'll do anything, just please don't turn away." But the more she apologized, the further away he seemed to drift. Each word she uttered reminded him of the betrayal, replaying the wound instead of healing it. To her, apologies felt like lifelines. To him, they were chains pulling him deeper into memories he wanted to forget. One evening she couldn't hold it in anymore. She dropped to her knees before him, tears streaming down her face, her hands clutching his. "Please," she cried, her voice breaking. "I know I hurt you. I know I ruined everything. But I can't live like this. Just tell me what to do and I'll do it. I'll change. I'll give up everything. Just, don't look at me like I'm nothing." He looked down at her, his eyes unreadable. Slowly he pulled his hands free and stood, his expression calm, detached. "It's not about what you do now," he said quietly. "It's about what you already did. Respect doesn't return with apologies. Once it's gone, it's gone." Then he turned and walked away, leaving her crumpled on the floor, sobbing into her palms. Her heart ached with a longing she couldn't soothe. She replayed his words again and again, searching for some hidden softness, some glimmer of hope. But no matter how she twisted them in her mind, they always led to the same truth. His respect was gone, and without it, her apologies were echoes in an empty room. She tried new strategies. Instead of saying sorry, she tried to show it in actions. She cooked his favorite meals, cleaned the house with meticulous care, left small notes in his pockets reminding him of the love they once shared. But he treated it all with polite distance, as if she were a stranger performing acts of kindness out of obligation, not love. Once she found him sitting quietly in the courtyard, reading. She placed a cup of tea beside him, her eyes hopeful. "I made it just the way you like," she said softly. He glanced at the cup, nodded once and returned to his book. No smile. No warmth. Just acknowledgement. That night she broke again. She lay beside him, her tears dampening the pillow, her words trembling through the darkness. "I can't lose you," she whispered. "Please don't shut me out. I'll keep saying sorry until you believe me. Until you forgive me." But he didn't turn, didn't respond. His silence was an answer she refused to accept, yet it grew heavier with every passing day. The begging heart inside her refused to quiet down. It drove her to humiliating lengths. She called his friends secretly, asking them to speak to him, to remind him of the woman she used to be. She sent him long letters, pouring out her soul, promising redemption, promising loyalty, promising anything that might touch his heart again. But he left the letters unopened on the table, untouched, like they carried no meaning at all. Each rejection tore her apart. Once she had been the woman he admired. Now she was reduced to a shadow following him, begging for scraps of attention. She hated herself for it, hated the way she had fallen from grace, but she couldn't stop. Her love had turned into desperation, and desperation had no dignity. One night, her sobs became too heavy to hold in. She clutched his arm, shaking him awake. "Tell me what you want me to do," she cried. "Tell me how to fix this. I'll do anything, anything, just please don't leave me in this silence." For a long moment he stared at her. His eyes softened slightly but not with affection, only pity. And pity was worse than anger, worse than hate. Finally he whispered, "You think love is about begging. But love without respect is slavery. And I won't be part of that." Her heart shattered. She let go of his arm, her body collapsing into the sheets as sobs racked her chest. He turned away again, his silence returning like an endless night. She cried until her throat was raw, her body trembling, her spirit breaking. In that moment she realized something more painful than betrayal itself. Apologies cannot resurrect respect. They are just words, empty against the weight of lost dignity. And no matter how much she begged, he would never look at her the way he once did. Tears became her only language. Where once she spoke with laughter, wit, and the confidence that had captivated him, now all she could offer were sobs. She cried in the mornings when he left for work, her hands clutching the edge of the door after it closed. She cried in the afternoons, sitting by the window, staring at the courtyard where he sometimes sat in silence. She cried at night, when the distance in their bed stretched further than oceans. Tears soaked her pillow, her scarf, even her sleeves. She thought if she cried enough, he would remember the woman he once cherished. But his heart no longer moved at the sight of her brokenness. At first she cried quietly, trying not to disturb him. She buried her face in the blanket, muffling the sounds. But her silence felt unbearable. Soon, her sobs became louder, deliberate, as if she wanted to force him to listen. When he didn't, she began to weep openly, throwing herself on the floor, clutching her chest as if her heart was splitting apart. "Please," she would whisper through her tears, "please look at me, please remember us." But his indifference remained like stone. Sometimes he simply left the room. Other times he stayed, but with eyes so distant it was as though she weren't even there. Her tears fell at his feet, but he walked past them as if they were drops of rain on the ground. Neighbors began to notice. Through the thin walls, they sometimes heard her cries late into the night. Women whispered about her misery, about the man who had turned to ice, about what might have happened between them. She felt their pity when she walked outside, their eyes lingering on her swollen lids, the redness around her nose. Once she had been admired as the strong wife, the woman who carried herself with grace. Now she was seen as the woman who cried too much. She hated how pathetic she had become, yet she couldn't stop. Tears were the only weapon she had left, the only proof of her love, the only way to show him that she was still there, still waiting for him to come back. She began to think if she cried enough, if she made her pain visible enough, maybe it would soften him. Maybe he would see her suffering and take pity on her heart. But pity was all he gave her, and even that was rare. One night, as her sobs echoed in the dark, he turned and said quietly, "Do you think your tears will change what happened? They don't wash away the truth. They only remind me of it." His words broke her more than silence ever could. She buried her face in her hands, ashamed, realizing that even her sorrow had become a burden to him. Still she cried. She couldn't stop herself. Tears had become her second skin. She cried when she cooked, her hands trembling over the stove. She cried while washing clothes, her vision blurred by the sting of salt water. She cried even when no one was around, because the grief within her had no escape but through her eyes. One evening she collapsed in the courtyard, her knees scraping the stones as she sobbed uncontrollably. He stood at the doorway watching her quietly. For a moment she thought he might rush to her side, lift her up, hold her the way he once did. But instead he only said, "You think this makes me come closer? All it does is show me how far you've fallen." Then he walked back inside, leaving her shattered under the fading sunlight. Her tears grew heavier, more desperate. She stopped trying to explain herself in words because she realized he didn't believe them anyway. All she could do was cry. Her eyes, swollen and red, told the story her voice couldn't carry. But what she failed to see was that her endless tears didn't inspire compassion. They drained what little patience he had left. One night, in the silence of their room, she wept so loudly that he finally sat up. For a fleeting moment, her heart leapt with hope. Maybe he would console her, maybe he would speak, maybe he would let her back into his heart. But instead, his voice was firm, almost weary. "Stop crying. It doesn't move me anymore. Do you understand? Your tears don't fix what you broke." She froze, her sobs caught in her throat. His words were final, a door slammed shut. She curled into herself, covering her face, ashamed of the weakness she had displayed. But even as she tried to stop, the tears flowed again, unbidden. They were not a choice anymore, they were who she had become. Tears had replaced her laughter, her respect, her dignity. And though she cried for his attention, all she earned was his distance. What once had been her expression of love had now turned into proof of her helplessness. And every time he walked past her swollen eyes without a glance, she realized more and more, tears could not rebuild the pedestal she had broken. Tears became her only language. Where once she spoke with laughter, wit, and the confidence that had captivated him, now all she could offer were sobs. She cried in the mornings when he left for work, her hands clutching the edge of the door after it closed. She cried in the afternoons, sitting by the window, staring at the courtyard where he sometimes sat in silence. She cried at night, when the distance in their bed stretched further than oceans. Tears soaked her pillow, her scarf, even her sleeves. She thought if she cried enough, he would remember the woman he once cherished. But his heart no longer moved at the sight of her brokenness. At first, she cried quietly, trying not to disturb him. She buried her face in the blanket, muffling the sounds. But her silence felt unbearable. Soon, her sobs became louder, deliberate, as if she wanted to force him to listen. When he didn't, she began to weep openly, throwing herself on the floor, clutching her chest as if her heart was splitting apart. "Please," she would whisper through her tears, "please look at me, please remember us." But his indifference remained like stone. Sometimes he simply left the room. Other times he stayed, but with eyes so distant it was as though she weren't even there. Her tears fell at his feet, but he walked past them as if they were drops of rain on the ground. Neighbors began to notice. Through the thin walls, they sometimes heard her cries late into the night. Women whispered about her misery, about the man who had turned to ice, about what might have happened between them. She felt their pity when she walked outside, their eyes lingering on her swollen lids, the redness around her nose. Once, she had been admired as the strong wife, the woman who carried herself with grace. Now she was seen as the woman who cried too much. She hated how pathetic she had become, yet she couldn't stop. Tears were the only weapon she had left, the only proof of her love, the only way to show him that she was still there, still waiting for him to come back. She began to think if she cried enough, if she made her pain visible enough, maybe it would soften him. Maybe he would see her suffering and take pity on her heart. But pity was all he gave her, and even that was rare. One night, as her sobs echoed in the dark, he turned and said quietly, "Do you think your tears will change what happened? They don't wash away the truth. They only remind me of it." His words broke her more than silence ever could. She buried her face in her hands, ashamed, realizing that even her sorrow had become a burden to him. Still she cried. She couldn't stop herself. Tears had become her second skin. She cried when she cooked, her hands trembling over the stove. She cried while washing clothes, her vision blurred by the sting of salt water. She cried even when no one was around, because the grief within her had no escape but through her eyes. One evening she collapsed in the courtyard, her knees scraping the stones as she sobbed uncontrollably. He stood at the doorway watching her quietly. For a moment she thought he might rush to her side, lift her up, hold her the way he once did. But instead he only said, "You think this makes me come closer? All it does is show me how far you've fallen." Then he walked back inside, leaving her shattered under the fading sunlight. Her tears grew heavier, more desperate. She stopped trying to explain herself in words because she realized he didn't believe them anyway. All she could do was cry. Her eyes, swollen and red, told the story her voice couldn't carry. But what she failed to see was that her endless tears didn't inspire compassion. They drained what little patience he had left. One night, in the silence of their room, she wept so loudly that he finally sat up. For a fleeting moment, her heart leapt with hope. Maybe he would console her, maybe he would speak, maybe he would let her back into his heart. But instead, his voice was firm, almost weary. "Stop crying. It doesn't move me anymore. Do you understand? Your tears don't fix what you broke." She froze, her sobs caught in her throat. His words were final, a door slammed shut. She curled into herself, covering her face, ashamed of the weakness she had displayed. But even as she tried to stop, the tears flowed again, unbidden. They were not a choice anymore, they were who she had become. Tears had replaced her laughter, her respect, her dignity. And though she cried for his attention, all she earned was his distance. What once had been her expression of love had now turned into proof of her helplessness. And every time he walked past her swollen eyes without a glance, she realized more and more, tears could not rebuild the pedestal she had broken. The nights grew longer and the silence between them colder. She would sit by the window, watching the stars as if they could give her back the dignity she had lost. He would sit in the same house, but it felt like a different world. His heart armored, his respect gone. She remembered when his eyes lit up at her words, when his pride was her shield, when her strength was the flame that drew him closer. Now he barely looked at her. The absence of his respect weighed heavier than anger, heavier than rejection. It was emptiness, and emptiness was worse than hate. Her regret clawed at her soul. She replayed the moment of betrayal over and over again. If only she had chosen differently. If only she had thought of what she was risking. But, "if only," was a cruel phrase, it changed nothing. She would pass him in the hallway, her hands trembling with the urge to touch him, her lips desperate to form apologies. Yet she knew her words meant nothing. Apologies, no matter how sweet, could not rebuild the broken foundation of trust. She began to cry in places he couldn't see, the kitchen, the bedroom when he slept, the courtyard when he left for work. Tears stained her days, but tears did not move him. For he had seen enough of them to know they weren't love, they were desperation. He had given her his all and she had thrown it away, thinking she could get it back with soft sobs and promises. But respect is not a coin to be traded. Once spent carelessly, it does not return. Her regret was a fire inside her, burning without relief. She realized too late that love without respect was hollow. He might still share a roof with her, might still breathe the same air, but his soul had already left. She tried to show him gestures of care. His favorite meals, folded clothes, soft greetings, but everything felt staged, rehearsed, forced. And he saw through it all. Where once her touch had warmth, now it felt like an act. One evening she broke. She knelt before him, her hands clutching his as tears streamed down her face. "Please," she whispered, her voice raw. "I was wrong. I destroyed what we had, but I can't live like this. Just give me one chance to make it right." Her words echoed against the walls, but his silence was louder. He looked down at her, and though his eyes were calm, they carried a distance no apology could bridge. "You want forgiveness," he finally said, his voice steady, almost tired. "But forgiveness is not the same as respect. I can forgive you, yes. But the respect I once had, that is gone. And without respect, love cannot survive." His words cut sharper than any blade. They were not shouted, not filled with rage, but spoken with a certainty that left no room for hope. She realized then that her cries were not for him, they were for herself. For the woman she used to be, for the love she once held, for the life that could have been. Regret was her only companion now, a shadow that followed her with every breath. And the more she tried to escape it, the more it burned, reminding her of what she had lost forever. She understood too late that love is fragile, but respect is sacred. And once it is broken, the heart never beats the same way again. She stood in front of the mirror, adjusting her scarf for the 10th time, as if perfecting her reflection could somehow mend the cracks in his heart. The house felt colder than ever, not because of the weather but because of his silence. He sat in the courtyard, sipping tea slowly, his eyes fixed on the ground as though every answer to his pain lay hidden in the dust beneath his feet. She brought him his favorite dish, the one she had cooked countless times in the early days of their marriage when laughter still lived between them. He took a bite, polite but distant, as if she were a stranger feeding him. She tried soft words, carefully chosen, hoping they would weave bridges across the distance. She tried tears, letting them fall openly, hoping they would soften the stone he had built around his heart. She tried laughter, pretending to stumble, pretending to joke, hoping the sound might remind him of what they once shared. She tried gifts, small things bought with trembling hands, hidden in his pockets, left on his bed, desperate tokens of love now met with silence. She even tried anger, shouting at the emptiness in him, hoping a spark of his old self would flare up and fight with her, because even fighting was better than this nothingness. But every attempt fell into a void. He had already crossed into a place where her efforts could not reach. What she didn't know was that respect, once lost, does not return with effort. It does not return with apologies, with meals, or with tears. Love may forgive, but respect, once shattered, often dies quietly, leaving nothing but silence behind. That night, when she placed her hand on his arm one last time, whispering, "Please, I can't lose you," he turned to her slowly, his eyes empty of warmth. His words were gentle, but they carried the final weight of truth. "You already did." Her cries echoed through the small house like a storm no one wanted to notice. She sat on the edge of the bed, clutching her chest as if the pain inside might rip through her skin. Tears poured down her face, but he sat across the room, silent, unmoved, staring at the wall as though her voice had never existed. She cried louder, hoping the force of her grief would reach him, would break through the cold shield he had wrapped around himself. She called his name again and again, her voice trembling, desperate, cracking into pieces. But every sound she made was swallowed by his silence, and silence proved stronger than every scream. Neighbors could have heard her if they listened closely. The walls carried her sobs, the night carried her broken whispers, but no one came. It was as if the world had decided her tears were meaningless. She wasn't crying for help anymore, she was crying for the man who once held her when she trembled, who once wiped those same tears with his hands. But now, those hands stayed folded in his lap, motionless, unwilling to reach for her. She wept until her voice was raw, until her body ached from the weight of sorrow, until she realized something cruel. Silence can kill love faster than anger, and sometimes the most painful answer is no answer at all. She stood at the doorway, her eyes searching for his. He was reading, quietly, as he always did after long days of work. She cleared her throat, shifted her weight, even let out a loud sigh, waiting for him to look up. But his eyes never lifted from the page. She wanted his attention, craved it like air, but she had never given him what he needed most: respect. She dismissed his efforts when he provided, mocked his silence when he chose peace, and spoke louder than his voice when he tried to explain. In her world, attention was love, and love meant he should bend to her needs. In his world, love could not survive where respect was denied. She tried again, louder this time, asking questions she didn't really mean, making small dramas out of nothing, hoping he would put his book aside. He didn't. His silence was not anger, it was exhaustion. He had learned long ago that giving her attention only fed her pride, not their bond. When she finally snapped, "Why don't you listen to me anymore?" he looked up slowly, his face calm but his eyes heavy. His reply was simple, but it cut through her cries: "You never listened to me either." And in that moment she realized the cruel truth: attention without respect is noise, and love without respect is already gone.